Good morning, everybody. So thank you so much for coming today, and that was a beautiful song. So we are here today for the International Stigma Conference, so glad that you're here. And that was just such a great performance. So my name is Joanne Adelberg. I'm a genetic counselor and family advocate in the Department of Pediatrics. So I may have met some of you in the past. I see we have those med students back there in the corner. I may have seen you in clinic. Thank you for coming. But we're so happy that you're here. I know that things are progressing right along. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Mandisa Moore O'Neill. She just came in, so we'll give her a second to settle down. And she'll be giving today's keynote. The keynote is entitled HIV Decriminalization as a Necessary Strategy to End HIV Stigma. And following the keynote is Dr. Miranda Ward, and she's in the back over there. And she is the Assistant Professor and Director of Equity, Department of Clinical Research and Leadership at George Washington School of Medicine and Health Science, and she will moderate our plenary session. And a little bit about Mandisa. Mandisa Moore O'Neill is a Black feminist, cultural and political strategist, and the Executive Director of the Center for HIV Law and Policy. An abolitionist legal and policy organization that operates within and around the criminal, legal, and public health systems at the state and federal level. And their purpose is to craft just policies that increase the quality of life for people living with HIV and other stigmatized health conditions. Before joining the Center for HIV Law and Policy, she founded the Moore O'Neill Law Group, a civil rights practice with a focus on HIV decriminalization, litigation, family law, employment, and public accommodation for discrimination work, and police accountability. Her current organizing support work is as a member of SONG, a New Orleans chapter and founding member of the Louisiana Coalition on Criminalization and Health. Welcome, Mandisa Moore O'Neill.
Hello, everybody. Happy Thursday, y'all. I apologize. I'm excited to be here. First, I just want to say thank you to Howard and the International Conference on Stigma. It is always a timely conversation and always very necessary. I also want to thank Gilead Sciences for hosting this keynote. And also want to thank the staff of the Center for HIV Law and Policy, who I have the very honor of leading as their ED, including our senior staff attorney, Jada Hicks, who I will talk more about all of the amazing work that she does. You know, I know everyone is still really processing what happened on the 5th of November. And in many ways, what happened on the 5th has actually been coming to that fruition in many ways. So I think it's intentional that we get to have a conversation about stigma, which is actually a conversation about power and how it's arranged and the ways that we can confront power, not only in the public health world, if we find ourselves in that world, also in the other sectors that we find ourselves in. Because it's clear that stigma is not only not going away, it is actually on the rise, and it's going to take forms that we thought were eradicated. That wasn't the start of my keynote, that was just the start to the start. So the start to my keynote is, as a Black feminist, I'm always thinking of who are the Black women who guide me. You know, like who are the people whose words and political analysis shape how I am an advocate, how I'm an attorney, and how I lead my organization. And Toni Cade Bambara really sticks out to me, namely her essay, The Education of a Storyteller. And the first line of her essay is so provocative. She says, "What are you pretending not to know today, my dear?" So you might wonder, what does Toni Cade Bambara have to do with HIV stigma? Well, I'm gonna come back to that, but keep in mind as I'm talking that we live in a context in which what is happening is actually really plain and really crystal clear, and a question that I find it helpful to ask as an advocate is, do you really not know, or are you saying that you don't know because it makes you more comfortable? So I'm gonna start with the story. So, I'm not someone who is living with HIV. So a question that people often ask is, well, why do you go so hard for people living with HIV, Mandisa? Like, why do you lead an organization that is dedicated on making sure that people living with HIV have the dignity and the rights that people not living with HIV, who aren't living with other stigmatized health conditions, have in many ways? And I'll tell one story of how I actually came into namely HIV criminalization, which I'll talk some more about later. I don't want to assume that everyone knows what that is. So after law school, I was actually doing a lot of legal aid work, namely representing people living with HIV around discrimination needs, because many folks don't realize, but HIV is a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So employment discrimination, housing discrimination, public accommodation discrimination, and also assisting people in getting on a disability. And I had many clients in Baton Rouge, which, as many may know, is a city that has many people living with HIV and some of the highest testing rates in the country. In fact, my home state of Louisiana is often known for crawfish and Mardi Gras, and that's all true, but we also have 2 cities with the top 5 diagnoses in the country, which I think is significant for such a small state. So I had many clients, and 5 always stick out to me. They were very different across race, across class experiences, but the 2 things they had in common is all 5 of them were living with HIV and were all experiencing intimate partner violence. And all of their partners were very well aware of what some people don't know, and that is Louisiana's intentional exposure law, which says that anyone who's accused of exposing someone to HIV, it doesn't require that transmission occurred, it doesn't require that there was an intent to transmit, and it doesn't take into account the types of behavior that could even transmit. All it requires is that you knew your HIV status and allegedly didn't disclose it. And these men knew that and used this law as a tool of control in these women's lives, and said, if you try to leave me, or if you tell someone about my abuse, I'm gonna go to the cops and I'm gonna tell them that you exposed me. And it's because they understood how powerful stigma was, that they are the perpetrator of violence, but they understood that because of HIV stigma and patriarchy, no one was going to believe these women. And it was an effective tool. And unfortunately, data and research shows that women living with HIV are actually more likely to experience intimate partner violence. And this is the US, right? So women already experience intimate partner violence. So we're already starting the conversation here. Then you add their HIV status, we're talking about here. that was the first that I'm thinking, I finished law school, I know the laws. I had never heard of this statute. I was like, what? So went and researched it, and I was like, this is wild. This sets people up. Even if I know if my partner told me their status, I can lie and say they didn't. And because of how poorly it's written, they could go to jail. So do you see how it's automatically this tool of violence in people's lives? Even though they say the intent is to catch those people who meant to transmit and did transmit. But it says exposure. So do you see the disconnect? There's no sort of requirement to prove your intent. So that's how I got into a criminalization work and realized that it was a political necessity to reform these laws in a way that wasn't leaving women who were already vulnerable even more vulnerable to experiencing intimate partner violence. It's one of the reasons I always say, if you are someone who believes in ending intimate partner violence, you should be an advocate against for decriminalization, because we understand how it's a tool that often keeps people in these relationships. So that's how I want to start this conversation about stigma, and why, if we're ready to actually address stigma, it is imperative that we address these laws and policies that are targeting people living with HIV. But it also brings me back to the very start of the epidemic. So even though, it was definitely cases prior to 81, most people see the LA Chronicles article and the New York Times article in the summer of 81 as a starting point of when the public began to know. It was these cases of homosexual men with this rare cancer. And I think that's very important, because even as these articles are being written, it's very clear that there's a very narrow idea of who is gay. So it's centered around white gay men. Even though anecdotally, I'm a Black Southerner who was born from Black Southerners, who was born from Black Southerners, who came from Black Southerners on. So my roots are deep, as are many people. And anecdotally, we knew people in our communities who were Black, who were not necessarily gay or queer, who also had these symptoms. So a question I always have that I think really gets us to where we are now is, what does it mean, who is deemed valuable of documenting? Who is deemed valuable of having their stories, even if it isn't a public health sense, who's deemed worthy of even having their stories be told? And if you ask who is, then it makes you ask who is not. And it is in the who is not, that's how we get the high rates of a criminalization across the country. I also think about, what does it mean that within 5 years of these first cases in the early 80s, how did we respond to what's now HIV? Was it care? Was it love? It was criminalization. Within 5 years, we had criminal laws on the books and arrests happening. So I also think about what that means, that something that is targeting the most marginalized of our community, and we already have a disconnect over who's being focused on and who's actually experienced it, then even with that, our response is to criminalize. It's to take what's called a punitive response, as opposed to understanding what kind of a public health response may be needed. My home state of Louisiana, we had our first HIV statute on the book in 1987. So I always think about, what does it mean that instead of trying to understand this virus, trying to understand how to protect people, how to love people, how to care for people, our response was to what? Lock them up. Does that sound kind of familiar? Are there some other health conditions that we also treat with incarceration? You know, I think we're at a place to be able to reflect on the war on drugs and say it didn't end drugs, but it was a war on Black people, you know? And I would say that this certainly didn't stop the epidemic. I would actually posit that these sort of criminal laws, as such an early and dangerous response, actually grew the epidemic. Because what it actually does is it makes people not like scared to know their status, which is the opposite of what we as public health advocates want. Like, we want people to know their status. We want people to be tested, be in treatment, all of those things. So Mandisa, I've mentioned HIV criminalization. Maybe someone's asking, what is it? So my organization, which is one of the leading organizations that works on the policy and legal issues in the country, we define it in two ways. One are criminal laws that target people living with HIV for conduct that is legal for folks who have not been diagnosed. So sex is consensual. If it's not consensual, it's not sex. If you're not living with HIV, there's not the same risk of a criminal charge or of someone using your health status for having, say, a other chronic manageable condition in the same way. But there's something else that people often don't think about, and that's the increased penalties. So a side note is, if we're talking about HIV, it's important to talk about some intersections, such as the criminalization of sex work. And unfortunately, in our country, as many folks know, it is criminalized. In most places, it is a misdemeanor. But it's this thing called an enhanced penalty, meaning if I'm somebody not living with HIV who's accused of allegedly the same-sex act, it's a misdemeanor. But that same-sex act, if I'm living with HIV, is a felony. The only difference is I'm living with HIV. And in many cases, there isn't even a requirement that the act happen. It's enough to have talked about it. It's enough to have slid in someone's DM and made an arrangement to be prosecuted for a felony. And in one such state, until recently, thanks to advocacy of CHP and many of our partners, it was a lifetime registry on the sex offense registry. It's like, it just gives you a sense. But also, HIV criminalization isn't just laws that specifically target, it's any time the criminal law is used to target people living with HIV. What that means is there are people living with HIV who were arrested for reckless endangerment charges or aggravated assault, or my personal favorite, assault with a deadly weapon. What is the deadly weapon you? What are they really saying? If your health condition is a deadly weapon, what are you pretending not to know today? What are we really saying? How are we then enforcing these stereotypes that are at the root of why Black people make up less than half of the population and more than over 50% of who's arrested in general? And that's especially true of HIV criminal laws. And I think that that's something else that is really important. These laws are egregious on its face. But when we see like the racist enforcement, we understand what this is really code for. Another way of targeting and persecuting our people. So even if we're not like in the public health field, right? If we're in the racial justice field, I would hope that an understanding of the criminalization of HIV is a part of our understanding of how our criminal legal system needs to be reformed. Because it's targeting people, Black people in particular, not just because they're Black, but because of their health status and what that means. It's also a part of this broad legacy that, you know, it is really important that we are able to confront. But what made me think of this conversation at this conference is, how is criminal laws, how are they connected to stigma? Well, the very start of the criminal laws comes from stigma, an unwillingness to understand what was actually happening and instead to respond to people who were gay. Remember the 4 H's? Folks familiar with that? Homosexuals, heroin addicts, hemophiliacs, and Haitians. Although the Haitian one sounds pretty recent, J.D. Vance, right? So it's clear it's about targeting people who are seen as disposable. But it's also important, like, for us to think about, while they did definitely start in the 80s, how are they very much alive in 2024? I don't know if folks spend time on social media, you could just spend about 5 minutes looking at any post on HIV, looking at any post, and they're always sensationalized, right? It's always, man is accused, infected, 20 people, and then, like, you read the story, one person accused them of exposing. But the damage is done. And I would like to be hopeful. And then I spent even 3 minutes, 3 minutes on social media in the comments, and I'm like, yeah, this is so far from a problem of the 80s. This is so far from a problem of the 90s. And I think what often gets us advocates really in a tizzy is the science of HIV has grown leaps and bounds since 81, since 85, since 87, even since 2000, even since 2012, when the first PrEP drug is available. There are now injectable HIV treatments. There are now injectable PrEP treatments where people don't have to have a pill every day. 5 minutes? Okay. That's why I have my phone. But it's important for us, even as advocates, it's important to focus on the medication, but it's also important, even in our intent to make things better for people living with HIV, it's important not to further stigmatize. So have folks ever heard the term viral divide? It's this idea that we should separate people who are virally suppressed, meaning that they have it's because of medication, they have so little virus in their blood, it doesn't show up in a standard blood test. And when that happens, it is impossible to transmit, called U equals U, undetectable equals untransmissible, transmittable. But what that means is that people then say, well, I'm virally suppressed, so I shouldn't be criminalized. So again, there's always the inverse, right? If I'm virally suppressed and shouldn't be criminalized, then I'm saying people who are not virally suppressed should be criminalized. And let's take it a step further. Who are the people who are most likely to not reach viral suppression? People with comorbidities. Who are the people, because of the racialized nature of health in this country, who are the people most likely to not ever reach a suppression, even if they take their medication and do all the quote unquote good things? So then what are we really saying about who should benefit from these reforms and who shouldn't? Or if we decide, well, I was in a monogamous relationship, and that's when I got HIV, so I'm different from the sex workers, right? Or the people who perhaps engage in injectable drugs. What are we saying? Who are we saying is disposable? How are we taking the same framework of how I was treated and deciding that it's okay to treat someone else that way? That's how stigma shows up in 2024. When I say I'm normal, I'm on medication, I'm virally suppressed, I'm not like them. So again, back to Tony Cade Bambara, it's important for us to really center our own biases and check the ways that we've really internalized stigma, even in our quest of doing work that is just and that centers people. It is also our work, especially in the political moment that we're in, to center innovation and center strategies that we perhaps haven't used before. For example, I've been excited that CHOP has been increasing our work with faith leaders. How exciting it is to think about including faith leaders in our advocacy to decriminalize. That's a result of the innovation of many of the people in this room. So I know time is up. The last thing I will say, I hope that folks leave with this message is, while it's important to point out the stigma over there, it is also an opportunity to reflect in the work that we have to do of destigmatizing our assumptions and how all of these assumptions lead to policies that don't actually center those who are the most marginalized. Thank you. I'm sorry.